Yeah, thank you, Beth. I was going to make that reminder, but here we are. We're all set and recording.
Is this better, Karen?
A little bit. Yeah, probably just stay muted except when you're talking.
All right.
Well, we probably all will need to mute. So, hi, Ellen. Hi, Phyllis. Julie. Hi, Julie.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
People are still arriving. Let's wait one more minute and we will go around with really quick introductions so we know who's here in just about another minute.
Well, then I'll take this minute to ask Carmen a question. I got an email. I wonder if any of the others of you got this email today from an outfit that I never heard of before. It's called America Latina Genera, Latin America People, and it's mostly in Spanish with an English translation, inviting us talking about Latin America and the Caribbean having biodiversity and climate change issues, and inviting us to anybody to a webinar about this. And like I said, this is from somebody I never have been on this mailing list before. And I'm just wondering if any of the rest of you received anything like this, if they, scoped our UN list or whatever. Carmen, have you heard of this outfit?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, I'll relay it to you, Carmen, just for your information.
Okay.
Okay, and then maybe Carmen, you can send it back around to us if it does seem interesting and legitimate to you. But yeah, it would be good if you checked it for us. That
Right.
sounds good. Thank you, Julie. All right, let us go ahead and get started. Welcome all. I think it would be good if we went around and said our names, where we're calling from, and that's enough for today. But be sure you get both of those mentioned clearly to everyone. I am Reverend Carol Houston, and I am calling in from New York City.
I'm Karen Korch, and I'm calling in from the Chicagoland area.
And I am Phyllis Marsh, and I am calling in from the Washington, D.C. area.
Marjorie, you are on mute.
I just, I'm Marjorie Davidson, and I'm calling from Annapolis, Maryland.
I'm Beth O'Connell. I'm calling from southern France.
I'm Ellen Barfield. I'm calling from stolen Piscataway land, now called Baltimore, Maryland.
And I'm Julie Steinbach calling from stolen, oh my God, I just drew a blank on what our land is here. I've got a sign in front of, anyway, Claremont, California. It'll come back to me. Wow.
Ohlone?
Okay.
What?
Ohlone?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right, work on that. That's
Morning
okay.
blank.
From the Philippines.
I'm Jeannie Lewis, and I'm from San Marcos, Texas.
Hello, I'm Carmen Capriles. I am in La Paz, Bolivia.
I'm Genny Peterson, and I'm in River Edge, New Jersey.
Hi, I'm Diana Smith in Paris, France.
Okay, I think that's everybody, huh?
That everyone? All right.
Yeah.
All right. This is Carol again. I first met Carmen in 2014. We had begun to be in conversation on Skype calls about a gathering in Bolivia, which happened at the end of 2015. And Carmen had emailed me saying that she was going to be in New York City, coming to the UN and doing some work there. And we decided to meet for brunch at a restaurant on Lenox, on Malcolm X Drive in Harlem. And it was delightful to begin to get to know Carmen then, and to begin my deep respect for all the work that she does around the United Nations. She kept saying that I could do the same, that I could be in the kinds of sessions that she was going to. And although I've become involved in CSW, I haven't done that because I sort of need this kind of deep dive into it, what it means actually to work within the UN in a really engaged way. CSW is a time when we hear reports, we hear what's going on, we hear what decisions have been made. Carmen gets to the sessions where those decisions are made, where the plans are begun that are then reported out. She is into levels of the organization that I hope more of us can begin to enter, and she assures me that we can. So Carmen, I am going to turn it over to you. I'm going to mute myself, and I hope that people will generally do that while you're presenting. There will be time for questions and at least toward the end, but muting right now is probably a good idea. Welcome, it's good to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. Well, actually, I know in person many of you, and yes, some online. And I hope that someday I'll have a chance to meet you all in person. Well, during the last decade, let's say, I've been really engaged with UN, especially in environmental policies from civil society sector. And I think it's important that more people get engaged into United Nations. But I understand that it's a bit hard and a bit complicated to kind of like engage, because for many of us, it's okay, United Nations, what is that? Why does that exist? What's the aim? And then suddenly when we start talking about what this United Nations looks like, it starts being so overwhelming because it's really big. We're talking about a system that includes over 190 countries, and that it shapes pretty much our reality today, and probably will keep shaping our future. So if I may, I would like to start speaking about a little bit about history, because it's important that we study history in order to understand what's going on today, and in order not to repeat mistakes from the past. So I'm going to give you an overlook of history in order to kind of like connect some of the dots that are important for us. So I'm going to share my screen. This is more like, it's going to be more like a class, and I'm sorry, but after that, we're going to have a space for questions and answers. So I hope you enjoy this talk. I have put a lot of effort in it, and I hope we can get a lot out of this glitch of what history has been and how United Nations emerged. Well, first, we should talk about what date is today. For me, it's the 5th of August of 12,021 of the Holocene calendar, or the human era. Why for me it's the 12,021? Well, scholar Cesar Emili, he proposed that our history should be taken into account 12,000 years ago, that we should move our year zero, because right now our year zero, it's only 2,000 years ago, but we're forgetting 10,000 years of human history. And why we go back 12,000 years? Because that's the date of the first building, which is believed to be a temple for religious purposes. That's the Göbekli Tepe. Probably some of you know how to pronounce this better than me. This is in Turkey, in Anatolia, Turkey. This is the oldest construction man-made that has been found on the planet. And since archaeology has been quite developed, we can now say that it's probably the oldest. And it's around 12,000 years ago. So it's important because 12,000 years ago, we had a religion. We had a religion that we probably do not remember the names of the gods, but we were already gathering in order to share some kind of faith. And also it's important because it's the first construction. Before this one, nobody did construction so big. They didn't mind on moving blocks from one way to another to create something, and to create something not for themselves, but for the community. So it's a very interesting starting point. So now we get into climate change. We're talking about, because 12,000 years, it's the Holocene. This is the temperature, the ice era, which many of you have heard probably in movies or in some books, how most of the Earth was frozen, and that's how the 12,000 years ago, as we can see here, there comes a period where temperature is warm, and temperature is like perfect for human societies to develop. So we can see it all in green, how the Holocene had a pretty stable temperatures, although there have been micro ice ages, but in general terms, in this period of 12,000 years, as we can see in this in the timeline, I don't know if you are seeing my mouse right now, but the thing is that the Holocene is the perfect temperature to develop human societies. And we can see here we have the big timeline, and here we can see the small timeline where we have the year 1, 2008, 2000 AD, 2000 BC, 4000 BC, 6000 BC. And also when we're speaking about climate change, it makes a lot of sense to talk about 12,021 in this specific date. So it's only adding a 1 to our normal calendar. And we can see here the projections on climate change, on how temperature is increasing because of man-made activities. So if we only take the last 2,000 years, probably we cannot see the impact that climate change, that global warming, that we're having on global warming and climate change. But if we understand the Holocene, then we can see how dangerous it is what is happening on in climate change. So, well, this is the global climate temperatures in the row below. And well, we are not the first humans to be on this planet. There have been around probably 8 species of humans in this planet, but we have many of them have had gotten extinct. We don't know if it was because of wars. We don't know what made our species, Homo sapiens, live until today, and many species that were pretty similar to us, like Homo neanderthalis, Homo erectus, Homo rhodensis, got extinct along the way. And many of them, like Homo erectus, lived on this planet for 1 million years. And we have been probably 2 million years in this planet as a species. And the most of our development came, if you can see in the timeline, this light blue that's besides the 0, most of our development as a species took place in these 12,000 years that we are speaking. So that's the Holocene interglacial period, where in 10,000 AD, we saw that we have the first temple, probably for religious purposes, but then we have animal domestication, agriculture started, then organized agriculture. In 6,000 AD, we start having cities, the domestication of horses, pyramids, the Bronze Age, Athens, the democracy in around 2500 BC. So that's why it makes more sense if we move R0 to 12,000 years ago, because we would have a linear history, which we don't have right now. And it's really hard to relate many of the issues because we don't see how much time has passed between one epoch and another. And this is the classic example are the pyramids of Egypt, that were made 3,500 BC, compared to what classic Maya is, which is 500 AD. So it took between the two kinds of pyramids, although they look alike, although they probably have similar purposes, although the pyramids in Egypt were basically tombs, the Maya pyramids had more religious and connected to God purposes. But it would help us understand how we have evolved as a society a long time. And again, we're going to go back to 10,000 BC, because this is the size of the world population over the last 12,000 years. So we can see that basically most of our history, we were not even a million humans in this planet. And then we have a little bit more by the year 0. Societies were much more developed. We have cities going on around the world. We have the Roman Empire in their best, and we have 190 millions of humans in the year 0. But what happens from the year 0 to today? Our population has grown exponentially, and especially in the last, 200 years? We have 60 million in the 1700s, We were not even a billion in the 1800s. And we finally hit the billion in the 1,000,000,065 in the beginning of the 20th century. So this is product of what happened that made our species be able to reproduce and to conquer the whole planet. So we have how in only a few years, we're talking about 3 billion in 1960, 4 billion in 1975, 6 billion in 1999 at the end of the 20th century. And right now we are almost 8 billion people. So this is the growth our population had. It's amazing. So why did this happen? And here we start speaking about the Industrial Revolution. First, the Industrial Revolution has been divided in four, and it's very important to understand the Industrial Revolution because it is a turning point in our history as humankind. As we can see from this, our population did not change very much because the conditions were kind of like similar until the time we start developing cities. That's where our populations start growing. And then with the Industrial Revolution, our population was able to peak. And it's important to understand that we're making our timeline, which was really big, around 12,000 years. We're going to start speaking about the last 200 years. So in 1784, we have the first mechanical, the first machines that were used to do a mechanical production. So it's the first stage of the Industrial Revolution. Start having machines that could do more efficiently the work that humans did. The second was the Industrial Revolution. There were first assembly lines, like Cincinnati Slaughterhouse. It was the introduction of the division of labor and mass production with the help of electrical energy. So once we start using electricity, we could use electricity to do a number of things, especially mechanized. And in the 1870s, probably the most important assembly line that we had, it's Ford with the cars that became something so worldwide and so is spread that even today, all of us take basically one car a week. It's very hard to find people that are not, especially in urban areas and in the Occidental world, that do not have a car or have access to mobilization by cars. And that's because of the second part of the revolution, of the Industrial Revolution. And here there is a parenthesis in 1945, where United Nations in the middle of the second Industrial Revolution was created, but we'll get into that. Then after 1969, we have the third Industrial Revolution through the use of electronics and information technology systems that further automate our production. And this is basically our modern era. Many of us have seen this transition and this evolution of technology. So it's important to highlight that we have the first programmable logical controller, which right now it's the computers, and how it starts shaping our life. And in around between, there is like not a specific date, but we have entered the fourth Industrial Revolution. That's through the use of cyber physical systems. And that is the use of devices like we're doing right now. We are living a digital world that has increased a lot in the last year because of the pandemic. And speaking of the pandemic, another thing that has contributed with this peak of the populations are vaccines. So we have the first development of a vaccine in 1796. we have a timeline of the vaccines here, which is pretty much, it can be overlapped with the Industrial Revolution. And it's because the Industrial Revolution didn't need so much human labor force. So people could develop in other fields, and especially science, because technology feeds on science. And that's how vaccines were started to give more focus, more time, more resources. And that's how they have developed. But most of the developments came in the 20th century. So all these are some of the bacteria. Well, the typhoid was in 1896. Then we have the cholera in the 1990s, diphtheria 1942, and so on. All these vaccines, hepatitis B, and so on until today. So vaccines have also helped a lot in this peak of population, and it's important to notice because, well, I was born between 70s and 80s, so I got all these vaccines that are mentioned before, and yeah, kids that are born today have even more vaccines to use, and that has helped that mortality decreases a lot. So we're going to enter into speaking about the history of pandemics, because pandemics are not a thing of today. So especially when we have so much conspiracy theories, it's important to go back and study a little bit of history. And this big purple monster that we see here, it's the Black Death, which was the greatest plague that has suffered mankind. And then we have smallpox. Smallpox, probably all of us are already vaccinated against smallpox. And then we have another interesting, because this is the death toll by size. So we're speaking the Black Death, which is 14th century from 1347 to 1355. Smallpox, which was in the 1520s, but it lasted until basically the beginning of 20th century. Right now, it's not a problem anymore. It's almost eradicated from the world, except by anti-vaxxers that we are starting to see some hotspots around the world. But then another big plague that we have suffered was the Spanish flu, which was 1919, almost 100 years ago. And also this graph helps us understand that plagues do not happen every 100 years, because since the Spanish flu was 100 years ago, we tend to think that, but it doesn't happen always that way. So probably the earliest one that we have record of is the Antonine plague, which was the Roman Empire in 165, 180, which took 5 million people. And considering the size of the human population at the site, it was huge. It had a huge impact. And here's also a bigger timeline of how vaccines have evolved in the last 200 years. And it's important because that has been our fight with one of our greatest enemies. It's not that coronavirus just appeared out of nowhere and it's a biological war that wants to wipe out the world. No. History tells us that that's not it, that we have been fighting these kinds of virus and plagues along all of our history. And most of the time we have succeeded. That's why we are where we are right now. So now we're going to another timeline. These are almost 3,000 years of war in Europe. So basically, you can see many of those who come from Europe or live in Europe know a little bit more about these wars than I do, because yeah, I come from a territory that was in another kinds of wars at a time. So this blank spot doesn't mean that they weren't wars. Many of these wars were not recorded, were not registered. As it starts happening around 2,000 years ago that with the Roman Empire, we start recording it. Because, for example, during the 3,000 years of Egypt civilizations, in the monuments, in the stones, in the temples, you can see and the history of the wars that they had with names, with dates, with aims, and who was the victor, and who lost, and so on. But if we see this 2,000 years of history, it's war against war against war, and here we have interesting crusades, the different crusades, and it was a period where you were born in a war, and probably that war lasted until you died, and probably lasted generations, you know, like the 100 Years' War and so on. So we were pretty much a culture that was doing war. Why we are doing war all the time? Because of resources, because of territory, because of land, because of power. So that has been the development during the last 2,000 years of history. Well, we can speak more, but we don't have the dates and the written records of these wars. So we're going to now get into 20th century and start speaking about one of the most important war that we had, which was World War I. And World War I, as you know, it happened from early 20th century. These were the countries that were engaged at the time. But before the war ended, we faced a pandemic, which was the Spanish flu. So this is a comparison of the death of World War I, which was 16 million, with what the death of Spanish flu, which was around, there are estimates between 50 million to 100 million of death. So why do we call it the Spanish flu? It's not because it started in Spain. It's because if you can see in the map, Spain was not engaged in war at the time. So they start sending the news and the records of what was going on with the Spanish flu. So since more of the data was coming from Spain, they start calling it the Spanish flu. But since all the other countries were in war, they couldn't say that they were facing this pandemic because that would give an advantage to the enemy. So we can see some of the statistics of US during the Spanish flu took around 6,100 deaths. World War II was almost 500,000. Well, this is COVID, but from June last year. Then we have the first World War that took the lives of around 115,000 Americans, North Americans. So it's the interesting data that we have in records that can help us kind of like estimate the numbers, because we don't have real records, and especially also from people in developing countries where they were facing the pandemic in another ways. So it's very interesting to kind of like study what's going on in this period, because we have the two main enemies of the humankind have been war and pandemics on almost all our history. Nothing has taken more lives than human lives than war and pandemics. So we have the aftermath of World War II, that is from September 1st to September 1st, 1939 to September 2, 1945, where officially the world ends. But what is amazing to see in both world wars is that our wars were not tribal. They were not around the territory that's besides us. There were not wars among neighbors. they were real wars around huge pieces of land, and they were happening in the whole planet. So this is a poster from 1942 that says, you can see target Tokyo and target Berlin. So it is amazing to see how we were seeing the planet at this time, how we were ready to go to war and to fight and to have millions of people killed, because the total toll, it's an estimated, some say it's 50 million, some say it's around 70, 60 million. And well, this is a graph that I took from internet that is 78 million. So kind of like that's where the estimate is of the killings of the casualties of World War II, because we also have to take into account that many civilians were dead, and we really don't know what that toll was and how they were affected. But probably this is and we have the numbers, how many were lost in the Soviet Union, how many in China, Germany, and then we go to Japan, who had to suffer the worst part, not in the number of deaths, but in how they had to suffer it, which is the two atomic bombs that were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that were like the turning point to really start thinking on ending this world before ending the planet. So now we're going to speak about the Star Wars, because we had the Age of the Republic. No. I want to see if everyone is awake and kind of like paying attention. And I want to know if this is kind of like interesting, and if you have any questions at this point.
I do have a question, Carmen. In just a couple slides back on the list of the pandemics and the deaths. No, go forward. I didn't catch what. There, that one. Thank you. It's under World War I. It says a 1968 pandemic, 100 million deaths. What was that?
The Spanish flu.
1968? Am I reading that wrong?
19.
No, underneath. No, don't go back. On the list, under COVID, World War I, and then stay there.
This one.
Yeah, that one.
There was a pandemic then.
Yeah, what was the 1968 pandemic?
I think it was flu.
Okay.
But I'm not. But I have heard.
1968 is
the year I graduated college, the year that Martin Luther King and JFK died.
It's the Hong Kong flu.
That's right, yeah.
Hong Kong flu, oh, okay.
Yes. Because, since we don't tend to hear about much of Asian history also, they had two big pandemics, which were the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu in mid of the 20th century. But the thing is that was happening in Asia, but in the Occident, we were already developing the vaccines that help us control many of the pandemics.
Okay, and it was in a different world in terms of awareness of what was going on in the rest of the world, unless it was an assassination. So thanks. I didn't, appreciate that.
Yeah, and around the Black Death, the Black Plague, we can say why it hit so hard Europe, because now we know that probably started in China or Nepal with the rats, because we have register of the sickness around those years, around 13th century and beginning of 14th century. But what was going on in Europe is that Pope Gregory, he had made a ban on cats. So he sent everybody to kill cats because they were the demon. Because actually, and it comes from ancient Egypt, where Bastet the god of magic. It's a black cat. And even today, we associate the black cats with witch and with magic. So in the time, they sent to kill all the cats. There were no cats in Europe. So rats were everywhere because they didn't have a biological control, and rats became the vector for the Black Plague. So that's why it hit so hard on Europe during the Middle Ages. And it's been one of the most deadliest periods of the whole of our history. Of course, after the plague, 100 years, it took 100 years for Europe to recover from the plague. That came the Renaissance period, where there was all this luxury and all this wealth in Europe. And thanks to that wealth and to that luxury and to all that evolution that went to Europe after the death plague, it's that they discover America. But that's another story for another time. So, okay, I want to know if someone else has another question.
I just have an observation. I don't know if it's well-grounded, but I am astounded at how the US and the Philippines are both in the top 17 most mega biodiverse countries in the world. And yet, we rarely hear of anything being started in the US, for instance, any plague coming from the US. I mean, if you're one of the 17 mega diverse countries, I don't hear the US getting blamed for anything, but the US saves through vaccines, although we know that a lot of vaccines are developed in Asia, Africa, you know. So I'm a little worried about how the narrative is being told. So I would really love to go into more research about where, for instance, the plague that devastated Europe started in Nepal and India. It's really hard to swallow for me. I would really go into more research about it. But, you know, it's all part of epidemiology. I don't expect Carmen to be an epidemiologist. So I'm just like really observing that there might be some bias to the way we tell our stories. That's all.
No, I totally agree, but it happened to happen there, but not all epidemics start in Asia. For example, AIDS is a zoonotic also that started in Africa. And here in Bolivia, we had epidemics. I know the history of Bolivia. We had a very recent epidemic in 1960s that was an arenavirus that caused hemorrhagical fever. So, and we had pretty lately actually in 2019, we had 3 cases of that arenavirus that we were able to have somehow contain, but that is kind of like an example. And in my country, that put us into a watch that we can start a pandemic anywhere. So it's not only that pandemics come from Asia, you're totally right, that's not it. But we don't pay much attention to pandemics. So that's where we start having bias. It's like the Spanish flu. Why was it called the Spanish flu? Because Spain was not in war. Yeah, we don't really know where it started. But the thing is that they call it Spanish because most of the information was coming from there. So it's necessary to put an eye on this, because right now, everything that we're eating, basically in all the Occidental world, which is pigs, cows, chicken, and I can tell you this as an agronomist, is being vaccinated. Cheap. Even if you go to the farthest rural place in Bolivia, for example, they are vaccinating their sheep because they know they cannot live if they don't vaccinate. They're going to eventually get sick and die, and you cannot eat sick animals. So what happens when you eat biodiversity or you eat wildlife, you start getting sick. And we don't pay much attention to that because we like to only think about the Occidental world as mainstream. So it is true, not all pandemics come from Asia. It is important to highlight that. And it's important to start putting more attention on pandemics because we have not gotten over them. And any pandemic can start any day, or epidemics, and it's very close to our relationship with animals. That's why I was explaining the example of the plague in the Middle Ages, because it is important that we understand how cycles work in order not to face pandemics every time, or epidemics. We know very little about epidemics, but we have seen an epidemic of Ebola in 2014, for example, and that was not coming from Asia either. So it's we have to put more attention about these issues, but since they are coming from places that we don't really care much about, then it's really hard to relate it to our history. So I don't know if there is any other question. Okay, well, I have tried to make a very long story short, so maybe we can continue if there isn't questions. And well, Star Wars didn't happen, but it's cool to know that in our times, most of the words that we see are on cinema. So after the war ended September 2, 1945. And it was thanks to the effort of a number of people and countries that were already, well, we know who won the Second World War II, which was Russia, allied with UK, allied with US. So this alliance kind of like started kind of like a vision at a time of not wanted to be in war, because war may be good for business, but it's bad for families. And at the time, because US didn't want to engage in Second World War, and it didn't engage until what happened in Pearl Harbor, and they were the ones responsible for the most important damage that we have done on Earth. Actually, for me, the Anthropocene begins with the first bombing of the atomic, with the first trial of the atomic bomb that was in early 1940s. So that's when we start like messing with nature as we have never messed with anything before. The power that gives us the atomic bomb, the destructive power that had, it really makes us shook as in a society, and then we had to take actions. And that's how the idea of UN was born. And that's how in October 1945, 1 month after the war has ended, well, all these talks were already going on in the last year or so, is that they came out with the Charter of United Nations. And then we have 50 nations that signed the charter that is basically based on human rights. And that everybody, wherever they are in this planet, has to have human rights. So, and also peacekeeping. We were in a war that could not afford to have another world war, because the losses that were physical, like infrastructure, were really expensive, but what was more expensive was the life of the people. And that's the thinking around 1940s, because everybody wants to go back home. Nobody wants to be on war. Nobody wants to be fighting. And fights were really unequal, because you had people on the trenches in Europe, and we had people in fighting with nuclear wars in the other side. So, and the world was not settled in one space. It became global, and we couldn't have a whole planet fighting over what. Do we really got what we were fighting for in World War? So it was a racial war, it was a power war. Was it for resources? Was it for what? So it really makes us think as humanity, and that's how we started United Nations. And United Nations, in a time where the whole planet was fighting, was able to show the best of mankind, that we were able to gather around as countries and start negotiating in a diplomatic way. Everybody sitting in the same table and with the same power to say things and to negotiate. Well, that's a little bit of the idealistic thinking. It didn't always happen like that, but kind of like that was the ideal. Because although we know that still a lot of power struggles went on during during the UN period. So UN period and human rights period starts in 1945. And it's also important because, well, machines have replaced a lot of slavery, but with human rights, slavery was basically abolished, at least in many of our minds, although it's practiced until today, but it's not something that we can allow anymore. In the 11,000 years that we have seen of history, slavery was something common. We could own people. It is a horrible thing right now to think that you can own someone else. And that's how, with this signing of this document and this gathering of some of the world leaders, well, 50 of the world leaders, they start building not only a Pacific planet, but also trying to achieve equality. And trying, because until today, it's really hard. And last year, we have seen with Black Lives Matter that we still have a long way to go to overcome inequalities that are ongoing until now. So United Nations was founded in 1945. This is how the world looked like in 1945. The light blue are the territories that were independent, but the ones in red were still colonies, basically mostly of UK, but also France. So, well, most of Latin America achieved their independence almost 200 years ago, 1980 or 1825, around 1825. And it was because they were guerrilla wars when Napoleon was fighting all the monarchs in Europe. So many of the Latin American countries have already achieved their independence, but that was not the reality on Africa. So still over 1/3 of the world population live in independent territories, and United Nations helped those territories to achieve independence. So, well, I should move this slide, but we're going to see it over and over again. These are the 6 organs of United Nations, which is basically the UN General Assembly, the UNGA, that happens usually in September, that it gathers 190 countries and they, in order to take the decisions about what it's going to happen, and basically those decisions are called resolutions. Then we have the Secretariat. Many of you have heard of Antonio Guterres. And then we have the International Court of Law, which is in Netherlands, in The Hague. And then we have the Security Council. Security Council has 5 permanent members, which are United Nations, United Kingdom, Russia, France, and China. which were like the countries that won the Second World War, and that kind of like became permanent. And then we have 10 representatives from other states that are rotating. Those are not permanent. They're chosen from the 5 territories of the planet, and like Latin America, like Europe, like Africa, Asia Pacifica, and so on. So those, the 10 ones are rotative. They will change again, they will change in a number of years. But then the thing is that the Security Council has a veto power and has a lot of power in this planet right now, because they are the ones to ensure peace in this planet. But then we have another office, which is the UN Economic and Social Council, what we know as Ecosoc, and it's responsible for developing issues, for support, cooperation, and so on. And that's where the agencies, the specialized agencies of UN, like UNICEF, UN Women, UNEP, UNDP, and so on are and depend of. And it's also where civil society engages. So we're going to basically see this space and how to engage in it in the next classes. And the other one, it's very important because it's the UN Trustship Council, and it was created to administer the trust territories, which were all these territories that haven't achieved independence, and UN helped achieve the independence of around 70 countries. So it was active until 1994, when Palau was the last trust territory that got independence. So from 1994, the trustship doesn't really work as a council, but it's important because it started with Israel in 1948. What happened is that all the people that were in refugee camps in World War II, most of them Jews, as many of you know from history, and I have to be really keen and delicate with this, because since I'm not from Europe, and we didn't really experience as a country Second World War, then it's kind of like something that is still, it's not something that I can really relate. So I know many people are sensitive with this, but I hope that I can be the most neutral in order to explain what happened with historical facts and not to hurt anybody's sensitive. And because after World War, they took all the people that were in these camps, concentration camps, and they didn't know what to do. So Russia didn't want them, UK didn't want them, US didn't want them. And they put pressure, US and Russia, and said, well, you have territories and you have to start liberating those territories. And the first one that was a colony of Britain at the time was Palestine. So they moved all these people from refugees camps to what is now called the State of Israel in 1948, because they said, well, they are Jews, they have a Hebrew background, and Bible says this, so it would be good to put them there because we have this territory, we're going to liberate it after being a very important colony that we also don't want to lose. So we're going to put all these people, and we're going to support all these people to stay in this territory. And they wanted to kind of like build an ideal country, let's say. But what happened is that in 1947, this is what Palestine looked and what the Jewish settlements look. And after it was in 1948, this is how they create Israel. And they came with a big problem because they divided Palestine into two. This is where the Gaza Frank is and where Jerusalem is. And then there has been occupation of territories ever since, led by some, not specifically called a war, but a number of, sorry, I just lost the word, but yeah, it's been a number of occupations that had took place from ever since Israel was created in order to take what was left of the Palestine territory. So it's been, if it's the first child of UN, but it's kind of like a spoiled child because also Israel gets a lot of international aid in order to have the means like for defense, for to develop. That's why it's one of the countries that has most developed in the Middle East, for example, and so on. But I want you to kind of like understand what happened in 1948 is like the equivalent if today we would take all the Black population from the jails in only US, all that Black populations, and we would move them to, let's say, Sudan, because Sudan is the latest country that was born less than five years ago. And we took them to South Sudan and tell them, okay, you can build your new country here, and we're going to give you all the money and all the aid that you need. And because many of the Jews that were in the concentration camps were already living in Europe hundreds and hundreds of generations. So that's important too, because we also kind of like skip a lot of the history. We think that the Hebrews and the modern Jews were kind of like the same. So that's kind of like what happened. And it was kind of like an experiment, but it would be like if today we move all the Black population of the jails in US and we move them to a country in Africa and tell them, okay, this is where you come from and this is where you can settle and build a new country. Given the fact that you were in jail, of course, probably you would prefer to build a new country. But we can see until today what the results are, and probably in between 2012, where the bombarding started, and 2014 were the first digital wars, because everybody got engaged with what was going on with Gaza and Israel, and start knowing about the history and what was the occupation and so on because of social media. So it was like, I would say it was the first digital war. Many wouldn't count it that way, but it was interesting how social media helped create awareness about this problem, specifically around the world that practically had forgotten about Israel. So achieving the independent states, these are many of the states that United Nations help create. There are around 70 states that were able to get independence thanks to UN, because the process was different as from Latin America, because we fought guerrilla wars in order to achieve our independence. But the independence in Africa was more diplomatic. And that's also why they're not completely independent, because many of the Francophone countries still use the franc and still send revenues to France. That's why France is still a rich country and depends a lot on Africa royalties. So it's important to kind of like understand that, and the relationship that we still have with the countries that have colonized us. Because, well, although it looks like it's a great achievement, those are things that we cannot forget, that we still have that colonized relationship with between many of the countries. The Commonwealth, for example, for UK, and and so on. So most of the independence countries were between the 1960s. So that's important to kind of like realize and to kind of like understand what's happening now, because this is modern era. So now we're going to go to 1962. Well, all these countries in Africa were getting their independence. What was going on in United Nations or in United States? For me, well, this is Rachel Carson that posted. That sounded so 2020. No, that she wrote a book that is called Silent Spring. That is, for me, the birth of the environmental movement, because Silent Spring started questioning the pesticides industry and the impacts that had, because DDT was this pesticide that was used in World War II. It started to be in mass use in World War II, was starting to take a toll on the ecosystem, especially in the case of not only bugs, but also birds. That's why it's called Silent Spring, because the birds were dying. So that's how she named her book. And she did all this research around what was the DDT and what was the impact that DDT was having, because they dropped the DDT in one nearby lake, and it started contaminated and started killing everything that was alive around there. So it started like opening our eyes to what environmental impact may look like. And it's the born of the environmental movement, because she started doing a lot of advocacy. The book started creating a lot of awareness about this problem. That's why in this newspaper article from 1962, 63 probably, it says Silent Spring is now noisy summer, because it's the first time that people were standing up against environmental impact. And it shook up the 300 million pesticides industry. It was 300 million at that time in 1960s. So you can think how big and how huge the pesticides industry is right now, because we haven't been able to abolish it for many reasons. Well, Rachel Carson died in 1964 of cancer. The link between pesticides and cancer, we can deduct that there is a relationship, although it hasn't been properly proved. And a lot is because of the lobby of these pesticides industries, but we can somehow relate that the number of cases of increased cases of cancer during the 20th century, it's mainly because of pesticides. So it's something that it needs more research. We cannot conclude that in any terms. I want to be really, really keen on that, but we can deduct that probably there is a relationship between pesticides and cancer. But the thing is that this is how the environmental movement started. And next year, when everybody was talking about what DDT was happening, then in front of United Nations, something wonderful was happening. The United Methodist Women Organization, they bought a piece of land and they started what the church center was, or is. Until today, we had a chance to be with Carol in the church center. UU has an office in the church center. And it's important because in United Nations, we had only parties, only the government representatives. And everybody from civil society was left out. So civil society in the 1960s, you can remember Martin Luther King, you can remember all the movement against war, we can remember the crisis of the missiles, we can remember a number of things on how social movements were started in the 1960s. And the Church Center is part of that history, and it's important because it allowed civil society to, if not to have a voice inside, but to have an eye inside. And that's what this statue, which is called the Eye of God, and this is a very nice chapel within, it symbolizes. It symbolizes that the people are watching what's going on in UN. And that is really empowering because people that were not related to government could also have a say, or could start seeing what was going on in the closed doors of UN. This is 1968, the Earthrise. And this is a picture that should, well, to me, it is overwhelming and it moves me a lot, because after all this history, we got to the moon, and it's the first time we're seeing our planet, all the people that live, everything that we know, it's only on this blue dot, as Sagan, one of an important scientists, call it, the blue dot. And it's the first time that we kind of like look into ourselves like a mirror. Before we didn't have mirrors, we didn't know what we look like. Now we do, and we think it's pretty normal. But it was the first time that we were seeing from outer space our planet. And it's very meaningful because we have achieved so many things until 1968, but we're still fighting for rights. We're still fighting against discrimination. We're still fighting for gender equality, for women's rights, and so on. So how can we achieve so much, like going to the moon, without being able to address all this system failures, if I can say it? And after that, what's going on in Latin America? We had dictatorships. Why? Because colonies, they need the resources that they have in developing countries. So the US, basically, they had the Operation Condor, and they were able to state dictatorships in Latin America. And these are the numbers of disappeared people. For example, in Bolivia, their estimate is between 100 and 500. One of them is my uncle, is my aunt Olga's brother, that we are 4 years in legal struggles in order to get justice. But we can see Chile had 3,000, Argentina had over 7,000, Uruguay had also 100, Paraguay had around 200 and 400, Brazil had between 400 and 1,000. So it was the darkest period that we had in modern history, at least for Latin America. But dictatorships were not over. Dictatorships were supported because countries of the North needed the resources of the South, and that it's important to acknowledge. And although they were in Latin America, they were abolished at the beginning of 1990s. Many countries until today are still having problems with dictatorships, whether they have another names, whether they make it look like democracies and so on. We cannot say that we live in a world free of dictatorships, and dictatorships are bad because they undermine human rights, basically. So we can see the comparison, how the world looked like in 1977, so how the world looked like in 2070, and the work, not all of United Nations, many of it came from grassroots movements that wanted to stop and to start the democracies and so on. But yeah, it is important to acknowledge that colonization after UN wanted to still have a grasp on these countries. And for example, in Egypt, the dictatorship was abolished in 2011. I was studying there and I saw the Arab, what they call the Arab Spring, and how a 30-year dictatorship was over because of people's movements. And that it's important to acknowledge what the role of civil society, how the role of civil society has grown in the last, I don't know, 50 years or so. So, well, now we go to Stockholm in 1972, because what the book of Rachel Carson had a chain effect that I don't think she could imagine what was going to happen. 1972 in the US, the EPA was created because of Rachel Carson's book in United Nations. That they had the National Environmental Protection Act that later in 1972 became the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. But that was going on in US. What was going on around the world is that United Nations had a report on human environment, because we were seeing not only DDT, but many of this industrial revolution was starting to have an impact on environmental issues. So that's why this report came, and it was the first call of attention to humanity to say, whoa, we are damaging our environment. So that's where the first, this first conference where they created the United Nations Environmental Program, which is UNEP, to kind of like start dealing with environmental programs and have them in the radar. So the lady that you can see here is Indira Gandhi. She was the Prime Minister of India at the time, and she was one of the promoters of this. And this gentleman that you can see is the first executive director from Canada. He was called Maurice Strong, and they started with a lot of hope to kind of like solve environmental problems at a time, this UN agency. Unfortunately, the history didn't came out as well as they wanted, as usually it is in UN. So almost 15 years after this first UN report on human environment, we have the Brundtland Commission report, which is called Our Common Future. And it didn't start speaking about only environment, but it came with a very important term, which is the definition of sustainable development. This is 1987. And the definition says sustainable development can be defined as a development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, this is Gro Brundtland. She was the head, she was Minister of Norway, and she was the one that led the commission that came out with this report and with this very important definition of sustainable development, because what it acknowledged is that our development was using resources in such a way that we couldn't guarantee resources for the next generations. So it didn't only see the environmental dimension, but then we start seeing all this social dimension and economical dimension of the problem, that it's not only animals that are dying in the lake, it's not only the birds or the bees, but also the populations that live around that are being affected. So it's also a very, very important term. And it kind of like give us the sense of urgency that something has to be done, and that it's not a local problem anymore. It's not only a lake in the United States. We are starting to see environmental impacts all over the world in different shapes. And that's how the report, and that's what the report says. And that's why it shooks everybody and says, okay, our development has to take into account that we cannot finish with Earth resources. And that was 1987, and we are in 2021, and still we cannot apply that, but that's another story. So 1992, it's the first the Earth Summit, which is the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, because from the 72 report on human environment and from the Brundtland report, we now know it's not only a problem of environment, but also of development. And development means acknowledging all these countries in developing countries. And it kind of like divides us into developed countries and developing countries. But what was important about conference is that it starts acknowledging the presence of stakeholders. But well, on the basis of the Brundtland report, it produced the Earth Charter based on the UN Charter, which is based on human rights. The Earth Charter is based on more on environment. And they identified basically three problems, which are three global problems, environmental problems, which are biodiversity loss, climate change, and desertification. So 1992, we were starting to speak about climate change. It's not something that it's recent and that came with Al Gore. It's something that already in 1992, people were talking about and were concerned about. So what do we do about climate change? Climate change still look like a problem that was really far away. Biodiversity loss, it still looked like a problem that was really far away. And probably land and desertification was the biggest because, yeah, we depend on land to produce our food. If we don't have land, good land to produce food, we don't have food and we die. But still, they became the three conventions, the most important conventions. And then they came with Agenda 21 and forest principles because we were acknowledging deforestation at the time. But although this was a major conference and it came out with this identifying the biggest problems, political will since then has been really low. In the case of the Biological Diversity Convention, as Ted was mentioning, US is one of the most biodiverse countries, but US is not part of the convention. But we, in a future class, will talk about the conventions. It is important that the Earth Summit was the first UN space that really acknowledged the participation and inclusion of civil society, and they were called major groups. And it started with 9 major groups, which were youth and children, NGOs, women, indigenous people, local authorities, trade unions, business and industry, science and technology, and farmers. So because sustainable development also identify one thing. We cannot achieve sustainable development only by governments. We need the participation of civil society in all their ways. Everybody has to participate and be aware in order to achieve sustainable development. So it's not only the responsibility of governments anymore. So now we start seeing environmental governance as a two-way path. One with civil society and other stakeholders, and one with the parties, with the governments. So it took a lot of years since the 1960s to finally be able to engage in 1990s, to be engaged in properly in the negotiations. So this is the first part. I think, yes, we have a little bit of time for questions and answers. And I'm sorry because I tried to make a really big story and complex story the most simple story that I could.
Thank you, Carmen. I really think you did a great job putting things together. Are there questions? Please let us know if you have a question.
I'm having a hard time.
Can't hear you, Carol.
Oh, I forgot to move my, oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying we have, just as Carmen said, we can take a few questions now and then we'll go on to next week. But thank you, Carmen. Really, really interesting.
Hi, Carmen. I was trying to get down the major groups. And I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You said there's 9?
They were 9, but now there are more because they're called stakeholders.
Uh-huh.
So for the Agenda 2030, it disappeared. Let me share it again, please. Because for the drafting of the Agenda 2030, we realized that not only these 9 major groups were important for decision making, and then we started a number of other stakeholders were included, which are what happened? I thought I was which are, for example, LGBTs has now a group, voluntaries have a group, elderly has a group, people living with HIV has another group, and so on. But the first 9 major groups are these ones that were also the ones that were related to sustainable development. And that's why it's important, the role of youth and children, because sustainable development acknowledges the next generations.
Thank you.
So my only comment at the moment, Carmen, is that I'm reminded of the James Michener way of writing great novels. He starts at the beginning of time, and that's what you did for us. So
Yes.
appreciate that perspective. Thank you. It was really fascinating.
No, I think it's important to acknowledge all this because, well, I am a mythology geek. I have always been. And of course, mythology is also very related with the religions at the time. So when you're starting to study periods before Christ, it's really hard to make your timeline because everything goes backwards. And for example, in the many believe that Ramses II was the pharaoh of Moses, but Ramses is 12,000 BC, but there isn't any record of Hebrew writing until 900 BC. So that's like 300 between one and the other. And unlike, because we know that he got the amendments written, so in stone. So in order to have them, the Hebrew should have had something written. So then Ramses couldn't be the pharaoh. Then who was the pharaoh of Moses? So and when we're going backwards in the history, it's really hard to understand what happened first and what happened next.
I really appreciate. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a question. For instance, regional groups like, let's say, G7 or the ASEAN, the Asia Southeast Asian nations, sorry, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or I don't know what else, or the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation groups, you know, how do they figure into the United Nations discourse?
Well, we have 3 more sessions when we're going to talk about the participation in United Nations, the main conventions in United Nations, how decisions are made, basically focus on the Ecosoc part, and we're going to talk how UN kind of like divides the world for practical uses, not like in real terms, and how we are going to be able to engage, and how all this UN is able to shape, as I was saying, what's going on today and may shape the future. So that's why it's so important to understand and to be able to advocate within it. So yeah, I can, in the next session, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, because yeah, it's going to be more practical. This is kind of like to understand what happened and how we were able to create this entity, which, although it has a lot of bad things and we can criticize it a lot, and many times we kind of like give it for granted because we think UN is not doing enough. It is something really hopeful to see all these nations sitting in one table and kind of like discussing the issues in a one-to-one relationship. Although there's a lot going on under the table, but at least that sense, it's and in order to come with agreements and with resolutions, that most of them are good for specific context, then I think it's hopeful. That's also why I think it's important to have more people engage in these processes, because I do think that many of the systematic issues that we're sorry, give me a second.
Take your time,
Many of
Karen. Tell me if give you another question to think about while you're drinking. Anyway, I was just, thank you for your answer. I was also wondering about, for instance, before the United Nations was organized, there were a lot less wars than after they were organized. Like, the world is really at war right now. There's only a handful of countries that are not experiencing war. So I think, like, what does the United Nations think it's responsible for and has the authority for? You know, like, does it feel like it's responsible for the wars in the world or not? I mean, to what extent do they think they can be held responsible for anything? Thanks.
Your question is really interesting and pertinent, and it is totally true. Well, wars as well as slavery have not been abolished, they have been changed. So we still see wars all around the world, but they are different and they have different characteristics than how war was made before United Nations, because they need to have another rules, because we have weapons of mass destruction that we have to control. And if there wasn't a United Nations and countries, I don't know, like, I'm not going to name anyone, but one of those countries that has nukes decided to do a war on another country that's in the other side of the world, they could just send the nuke and you had a whole country disappear, basically. This is not happening. Wars have not been able, but at least they are under another kind of like setting. And also in the case of slavery, because slavery, we cannot say it has been abolished, but it has taken another form. And those are the systemic things that we have to change in order to really achieve long-lasting peace. We cannot say that wars as we knew them, they are over. We're not fighting against territories or resources anymore. We're fighting against other kinds of things. Or before it was also religious motives that led to many of the wars. We are also not having that anymore. So it does need a much more closer and more analytic point of view that, yeah, I couldn't get to explain that so thin. but it is important to acknowledge that work has not been, but in the case of, I can give you the example of my country, Bolivia. We were born in 1825 with 2 million square kilometers. And we've been fighting with our partners, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, Peru. We lost to Chile and Peru, our coast in the Pacific Ocean. And we have been reducing our territory until 1938, which is the accurate, that's the last territory that we lose to Paraguay and to Argentina. And then that's because, well, that's where the oil and the gas are. And that was a war that was supported by, at the time where world wars were happening in the rest of the world, Total and what's the other one? And Standard Oil were fighting because which country would have the oil. So after 1938, we haven't lost any territories and we haven't been in war, kind of like thanks to United Nations. And most of the countries have been able in the last 50 years to maintain their limits, their political limits, in a more sustainable way, because before we could change the territories like every year, basically. If we see the maps, how territories have been evolving, how countries have been evolving, and it's thanks to UN that we have a map that, although it has suffered some modifications, like when URSS became Russia, or like 5 years ago when Sudan was divided into South Sudan and so on, there's still these things, but we don't have that change in the map so drastically as we used to have previous world wars.
So we are over the hour and a half that we intended to go, but we have more time next week and the week after. And so save your questions. Be ready for more of this next week. Thank you, Carmen, for leading us in this wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you, Carmen.
Yes, thank you so much.
Same time next week.
And Karen, where will the recording be?
I have to, it won't be up right away, but it will get posted to YouTube soon.
YouTube, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, good.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you, everybody.
No, thank you. And see you next week.
Yes. Yes. Bye-bye.